I've always loved the outdoors. There's something about the stillness of the forest, the quiet away from the hum of the city, that feels almost sacred. But after what happened last fall, I haven't set foot in the woods again. I don't think I ever will. It started as a weekend camping trip. Just me and my buddy Ryan, out to explore the remote stretches of the Cascades. We'd planned this for weeks to nights in the backcountry, hiking trails that barely anyone knew about. The kind of place where you're truly alone with nature. We parked at a small, almost forgotten trailhead just before noon and hiked in about 6 miles to a spot Ryan had found online. The place was breathtaking. A clearing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by towering pines with a small stream cutting through. As we set up camp, the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It felt like we had stumbled into a postcard. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner over the fire, shared some beers, and swapped stories until the stars came out. Around midnight, we turned in, lulled to sleep by the sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The next morning, things felt off. When I stepped out of my tent, I noticed footprints in the dirt around our campsite. They weren't ours too big and spaced too far apart. They circled the fire pit and stopped near our gear, like someone had been inspecting it. "Ryan," I called, my voice low. "Did you hear anything last night?" He emerged from his tent, rubbing his eyes. "Nothing." "Why?" I pointed to the tracks. His face paled as he studied them. "Could be a bear," he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. The prints were oddly shaped, almost like a person's, but wider and with claw-like impressions at the toes. We decided to brush it off and be more cautious for the rest of the trip. That afternoon, we ventured deeper into the forest, following a faint trail that led us to a ridge overlooking the valley. It was stunning, but the beauty of the view couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye shadows, darting between the trees, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The forest felt darker than it should have, the trees casting tangled, spidery shadows that seemed to move with the wind. As we prepared dinner, the silence became oppressive. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the stream and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. "Do you feel like we're being watched?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. After we ate, we decided to set up a small motion-activated camera. Ryan had brought it to capture wildlife, but now it felt more like a precaution. We placed it facing the edge of the clearing, where the forest seemed to press in, and went to bed, both of us clutching the knives we'd packed. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It was subtle, faint shuffling, like feet dragging through leaves. My heart pounded as I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear more. Then came a low, guttural sound. A growl, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, wet, almost like it was bubbling up from something hollow. "Ryan," I hissed. No response. "Ryan!" I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the campsite. And there, just beyond the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was possibly taloned gaunt, its limbs too long and thin. The head was misshapen, tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes glinted like wet stones in the dark. It wasn't moving, just standing there, swaying slightly, as if it were waiting. I froze, my mind racing. Was it a person? Some kind of animal? Whatever it was, it didn't feel real. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. The thing took a step forward, its movements jerky, almost like it was learning how to walk. The sound of its footfall sent a shiver down my spine, wet, heavy, like flesh hitting mud. I backed into my tent, fumbling for my knife. That's when I heard Ryan scream. I bolted out of my tent, knife in hand, but Ryan was gone. His tent was empty, the flap torn open. The figure was gone too, but the clearing was filled with tracks deep, clawed impressions that led from Ryan's tent into the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and the camera, barely able to hold them steady. "Ryan!" I shouted, my voice echoing into the trees. There was no answer, just the oppressive silence. Terrified but unwilling to leave him behind, I followed the tracks into the forest. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches and tangled undergrowth. The tracks led deeper, winding through the trees like a path made by something that didn't care about obstacles. After what felt like hours, I found Ida clearing lit by the moonlight, and there, in the center, was Ryan. At least, I think it was him. He was standing completely still, facing away from me, his body unnaturally stiff. His arms hung limply at his sides, and his head was tilted back, as if he were looking at the sky. I called his name, but he didn't respond. Slowly, I approached, every instinct screaming at me to run. When I got closer, I saw his face. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly, his mouth slightly agape. His skin was pale, almost gray, and there were dark, wet streaks running down his neck. It was like he'd been drained of something vital, and then he moved. Not like a person, not like anything I'd ever seen. His head turned slowly, impossibly far, until his lifeless eyes were staring directly at me. His mouth twisted into a grin, wide and unnatural. That's when I ran. I don't remember much after that, just the sound of something chasing me, its heavy footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the car, throwing myself inside and speeding away without looking back. When I checked the camera footage later, my hands shaking, I almost wished I hadn't. The video showed the figure creeping into the clearing, its movements unnervingly deliberate. It stopped outside Ryan's tent, tilting its head as if listening, before tearing it open. And then, nothing, just static. To this day, no one believes me. The authorities said Ryan must have gotten lost, but they never found his body. I know what I saw though, and if you ever go hiking in the Cascades, remember this: when the forest goes silent, when the shadows feel too close, don't ignore it. Some things out there aren't meant to be found. Telling this story always sends a chill down my spine, but if you're someone who loves hiking and camping, you might want to listen. I'm not superstitious, but what happened on my last trip to the woods made me swear I'd never go back. It was a late autumn weekend. The leaves had turned golden, and the air carried the first bite of winter. My best friend, Jake, and I planned a 3-day hike in a remote forest about 20 miles from the nearest town. Locals called it the Whispering Woods, not because of any creepy folklore, but because the wind through the trees sounded like hushed voices. Jake and I dismissed the name as a quaint bit of local color, but in hindsight, we should have paid more attention. The trailhead was deserted when we arrived, just after noon on a Friday. The forest was beautiful in an eerie sort of way, massive, ancient trees, their roots twisting over the trail like veins, and a thick canopy that let in only slivers of light. Everything felt muted. The sounds of our boots crunching leaves and the occasional bird call swallowed by the vast silence. The plan was to hike about 7 miles to a small lake, set up camp, and spend the first night there. As the sun dipped lower, the forest seemed to grow darker faster than it should have. The air turned colder, and the wind picked up, making the leaves rustle in a way that almost sounded like whispers. "I get why they call it that now," Jake said, looking around. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual, though the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. We reached the lake just as dusk settled in. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. As we set up camp, a strange quiet fell over the area. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of the wind in the trees. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, as we sat by the fire, we heard it for the first time. A faint sound, almost too quiet to notice at first, coming from somewhere across the lake. It sounded like a person crying, soft and uneven. Jake frowned. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just an animal." We both knew that wasn't true. The sound was distinctly human. As the fire burned lower, the crying grew louder, closer. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the trees on the far side of the lake. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing. Still, the crying continued, now mixed with faint, unintelligible whispers. "We should check it out," Jake said, standing up. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "If someone's out there, they'll come to us." But Jake wasn't listening. He grabbed his jacket and started walking toward the sound, flashlight bouncing in the darkness. Reluctantly, I followed, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The crying stopped abruptly as we approached the edge of the lake. The silence was deafening, and the forest felt darker than before, as if the shadows were pressing in. Jake swept the flashlight around, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a pale figure, darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" I whispered, gripping his arm. "Yeah," he said, his voice shaking. "Let's go back." We turned and hurried back to camp, neither of us saying a word. When we reached the fire, we found our gear scattered across the ground. The tent flaps were open, and our sleeping bags had been pulled out. But what made my blood run cold was the footprints. They were everywhere. Human footprints, but bare, like someone had been walking around our camp barefoot. They circled the fire, our tents, even the edge of the lake. We didn't sleep that night. Instead, we sat by the fire, knives in hand, jumping at every sound. The whispers came and went, always too faint to make out, but they seemed to surround us, moving through the trees like a circling predator. By morning, the forest felt less menacing, though the footprints were still there, stark against the soft earth. We decided to cut our trip short and head back. But as we packed up, we noticed something chilling. There was a new set of footprints, smaller and closer together, leading from my tent to the lake. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. The hike back to the car was nerve-wracking. The forest felt alive, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making us jump. At one point, Jake swore he heard someone following us. But when we stopped and turned around, there was nothing there. We reached the car just before noon and drove away without looking back. Later, when I checked my phone, I found something that made my stomach drop. A video, recorded sometime during the night. It was taken from inside my tent. The footage showed the fire burning low, shadows dancing on the fabric walls. Then, the camera shifted, as if someone had picked up my phone and carried it outside. The last thing the video captured was a figure standing at the edge of the lake, its back to the camera, impossibly tall and thin, with long, pale limbs. And then, the screen went black. I never found out who or what was in the forest that night, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. I've always loved the challenge of solo camping. There's something deeply satisfying about relying only on yourself, away from civilization, in the heart of nature. But after what happened last spring, I'll never camp alone again. The area was remote, tucked away in a national forest that few people visited. I had done my research maps, weather forecasts, and trail reviews. The plan was straightforward. Hike out 10 miles to a secluded ravine, camp there overnight, and return the next day. I arrived at the trailhead around noon, my pack loaded with essentials. The first few miles were uneventful. The forest was lush and alive with birdsong and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I neared the ravine, the atmosphere shifted. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, cooler, and an uneasy silence crept in. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel path. By the time I reached the ravine, it was late afternoon. The spot was beautiful in a rugged way, with steep rock walls on either side and a small stream cutting through the center. I set up camp near the stream, the sound of water flowing, helping to ease my nerves. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ravine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I sat by my small fire, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows cast by the flickering flames danced and stretched, giving life to shapes that weren't there. The uneasy silence remained, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. As I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I heard a faint noise, just beyond the light of the dying fire. It wasn't an animal. It was a voice. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then it came again, soft and distant, like someone calling my name. David. My blood ran cold. The voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clear, unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area outside my tent. The beam of light illuminated the trees and rocks, but there was no one there. Then I heard it again, closer this time. David. It wasn't just the sound of my name, it was the way it was said, slow and drawn out, like whoever or whatever was calling me enjoyed saying it. I stayed in my tent, clutching the flashlight and my camping knife, every muscle tense. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. It was impossible to tell. The voice stopped, replaced by a new sound, the crunch of footsteps in the gravel outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, circling my tent. My breathing became shallow as I tried to convince myself it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps stopped at the entrance to my tent. I held my breath, the silence deafening. Then, the fabric of my tent began to move, a faint outline pressing against it from the outside, as if someone or something was running their hand across it. David. This time, the voice was right outside, no more than a foot away. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment, I was frozen in fear. The next, I was tearing out of the tent. Knife in hand, flashlight bouncing wildly. I sprinted up the ravine, not caring about my gear or the darkness. The only thought in my mind was escape. As I climbed out of the ravine, I turned back for a split second. My flashlight caught a figure standing at the edge of my campsite. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its posture wrong, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was featureless, a pale blank surface reflecting the light. It didn't chase me. It just stood there, watching as I scrambled away. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove for hours before pulling over, trembling and drenched in sweat. I reported the encounter to the park rangers the next day, though I left out the more unbelievable details. They chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe a hallucination brought on by dehydration. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint whispers outside my window. They call my name, soft and drawn out, just like in the ravine. I haven't gone camping since. I don't think I ever will. I've always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness. Growing up in a small mountain town, I learned to appreciate the quiet majesty of nature. But no matter how much I loved the outdoors, nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced in Echoing Canyon. This happened a year ago, and I've barely spoken about it since. Even now, as I write it down, I feel the same creeping dread that haunted me that night. The hike to Echoing Canyon was meant to be a personal challenge, a way to test my endurance. It was a 2-day trek, deep into the heart of a forest few ventured into. The canyon itself was surrounded by jagged cliffs, its name coming from the strange acoustic effects of the walls. Locals said that sounds made in the canyon could echo for miles, sometimes even mimicking the voices of those who passed through. I dismissed the stories as exaggerated campfire tales. I wasn't superstitious, and I'd hiked enough remote trails to know that eerie sounds were part of the wilderness. I started early, the crisp morning air invigorating. The trail was overgrown in places, but I enjoyed the challenge. By late afternoon, I reached the canyon. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful stillness I was used to, but an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me. I found a flat spot near the base of the canyon to set up camp. The cliffs towered above me, their surfaces jagged and pale in the fading light. As I prepared my gear, I heard the first echo. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptibly a low murmur that seemed to come from deep within the canyon. I stopped what I was doing, listening intently. The sound faded, leaving only the heavy silence behind. I shrugged it off as the wind. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I lit a small fire and settled in for the evening. The canyon walls glowed faintly in the firelight, casting long shadows that danced and shifted. Around midnight, I heard it again, the murmur, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like voices, overlapping, too faint to make out individual words. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the canyon walls. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only jagged rock and scrubby bushes. But the voices didn't stop. They seemed to grow louder, more distinct, though still just beyond comprehension. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the cliffs. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, my voice echoed back, "Hello?" But it wasn't right. The echo didn't sound like me. It was slower, distorted, almost mocking. I retreated to my tent, zipping it tightly. I told myself it was just the strange acoustics of the canyon playing tricks on me. But as I lay there, trying to sleep, the voices returned. They were closer now, clearer. "Come closer." The whisper was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. "Leave," another voice hissed, deeper and more guttural. I froze, my heart pounding. It sounded as if the voices were just outside my tent. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight into the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I scanned the area but saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the light, I saw movement. It was a figure, pale and thin, crouched low to the ground. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at unnatural angles. It moved with an unsettling, jerky gait, retreating into the darkness when my light hit it. I scrambled back into the tent, zipping it up as if the thin fabric could protect me. The voices grew louder, more insistent, echoing from every direction. "Why are you here? Run. Stay." The voices overlapped, some pleading, others commanding. My head throbbed, the cacophony overwhelming. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat in the dark, clutching my flashlight and knife, waiting for something, anything to happen. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt meaningless. Eventually, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack, leaving behind everything I couldn't carry, and bolted. The climb out of the canyon was a blur. The voices returned, louder than ever, echoing my name now. David, David. But it wasn't just the sound of my name. It was the way they said it. Each voice warped and wrong, like they were learning how to speak. When I finally reached the top of the canyon, I turned back for one last look. My flashlight caught dozens of figures at the base, pale and still, their eyes reflecting the light like animal. One of them raised a hand, waving slowly, mockingly. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I've thought about going back to retrieve my gear, but every time I consider it, I hear the voices again in my dreams. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers outside my window. They say my name, just like in the canyon. I've learned not to respond. I've always been drawn to the idea of getting away from it, leaving behind the chaos of the city to find peace in the wilderness. It's ironic how the very solitude I sought out became the thing that almost destroyed me. This story isn't something I share lightly. Even now, months later, I find myself glancing over my shoulder when I'm alone, the memories too vivid to ignore. The trip was meant to be simple. 3 days of solo hiking and camping in an isolated section of the Pacific Northwest. The area was known for its dense pine forests and rugged trails, perfect for someone like me who wanted to disconnect. I'd planned everything meticulously: map, supplies, emergency beacon. The only thing I hadn't prepared for was what I found out there. The first day was uneventful. The trail wound through towering pines, their thick canopy blotting out most of the sunlight. The air was crisp and cool, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing and decided to set up camp. The night was peaceful, the fire crackling softly as I gazed up at the stars. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the gentle rustling of the trees. But something woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was the wind until I heard the distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside my tent. I froze, every muscle tense. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was an animal deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too heavy, too measured. Gripping my flashlight, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. Nothing. I exhaled shakily, telling myself I was imagining things. But as I zipped the tent back up, I caught a glimpse of movement just at the edge of the trees. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to make my heart pound. I shone the flashlight toward the spot, but the beam revealed nothing but darkness. The footsteps stopped after that, and eventually, I fell back into a restless sleep. The next day, I pushed deeper into the forest, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The trail became more rugged, the trees thicker, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and the silence more pronounced. By late afternoon, I found another clearing near a rocky outcrop and decided to set up camp. This time, I kept my knife and flashlight within arm's reach as I settled into my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I woke again. At first, I didn't know why. Then, I heard faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from somewhere deep in the forest. Too far to pinpoint, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I stayed still, listening as the tapping grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then, from just outside the tent, a voice whispered my name, Alex. It wasn't possible. No one knew I was out here. I hadn't seen another person since I started the hike. My mind screamed at me to stay inside, but my curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped the tent and shone the flashlight into the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Then, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing motionless among the trees. They were pale and featureless, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. Their heads were tilted at odd angles, as if they were watching me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking as I scanned the clearing. The figures didn't move, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, in unison, they stepped forward. I didn't think. I just ran. I grabbed my pack, leaving behind most of my gear, and bolted into the woods. The trail was barely visible in the dark, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps, many of them. Too many to count. The figures didn't make any noise. No shouts or cries, just the relentless crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. I don't know how long I ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around me. At one point, I tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping my palms and knees. When I looked up, the figures were there, surrounding me. They stood in a perfect circle, their heads tilted, their pale faces or what passed for faces expressionless. One of them stepped closer, its movements jerky, unnatural. It raised a hand, pointing at me, and then I blacked out. I woke up at dawn, lying on the trail. My pack was beside me, untouched, but all my gear was gone. My body ached, and my head throbbed as if I'd been hit. Somehow, I made it back to the trailhead. I flagged down a passing car and called for help, though I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those woods. Rangers who investigated found no evidence of anyone else being there. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear the tapping again. Tap, 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 and I know they're still watching. The plan was straightforward. A weekend trip to Hollow Ridge, a remote section of the Appalachians I'd heard about in a local hiking forum. Its isolation was what drew me in. Untouched trails, breathtaking views, and the promise of quiet. The forum posts did mention one peculiar thing though, a local legend about ghostly lanterns appearing at night, leading hikers astray. I laughed it off as folklore meant to deter tourists. I should have taken it seriously. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 5 hours, winding through narrow, poorly marked mountain roads. By the time I parked and set off, the late afternoon sun was already sinking toward the horizon. The trail was overgrown, with no sign of recent use. The first few miles were uneventful, the forest alive with the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the path twisted and turned through dense trees. I planned to camp near a small clearing about 5 miles in, where an old map showed a freshwater spring. When I arrived, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. I set up my tent quickly, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As the stars began to emerge, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual symphony of crickets and nocturnal creatures was absent, leaving only the crackle of my fire. I told myself it was the altitude or maybe the approaching cold front, but deep down, I felt the sense that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of faint footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the spring. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, the cold air biting against my skin. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly among the trees. No response. I scanned the area, but nothing seemed out of place. The fire had burned down to embers, and the surrounding forest was impenetrably dark. Just as I was about to retreat back into the tent, I saw it. A light. It was faint, flickering like a candle, bobbing gently as it moved through the trees. At first, I thought it might be another camper, but as I watched, I realized the light moved too smoothly, too deliberately, as if it were floating. "Hey!" I called out, hoping to get their attention. The light paused, hovering for a moment, before slowly drifting deeper into the forest. Curiosity overrode my fear. Grabbing my flashlight and knife, I followed the light, careful to keep my distance. It weaved through the trees, leading me farther and farther from my camp. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the forest seemed to close in around me. My flashlight's beam felt weak, barely illuminating the path ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the light stopped at the edge of a clearing. It hovered there, flickering faintly before disappearing altogether. I stood frozen, my breath visible in the frigid air. The clearing was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. And then I saw them, more lights, dozens of them, scattered throughout the clearing, flickering like distant lanterns. They moved in unison, forming a slow, deliberate pattern, as if they were tracing an invisible design on the ground. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something held me in place. Then I heard Ita low hum, almost like chanting, resonating from all around me. The lights began to converge, forming a circle in the center of the clearing. As I took a hesitant step closer, the ground beneath me shifted, soft and damp, as if the earth itself were breathing. In the center of the circle, something began to take shape, a figure, cloaked in shadow, its outline barely discernible against the flickering lights. Its head turned toward me, though I couldn't make out a face, just a void where one should have been. And then it spoke. "Why have you come?" The voice was deep and resonant, like 100 voices speaking at once. It wasn't angry or threatening, just curious. I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my answer. The lights around it pulsed, growing brighter. "You seek the path," it said, "but you do not understand its cost." I didn't know what it meant, but the weight of its words pressed down on me. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in. I turned and ran, stumbling blindly through the forest. The hum grew louder, more chaotic, as if the entire forest were alive with sound. The lights followed me, darting between the trees, always just out of reach. When I finally burst back into my campsite, the fire had gone out completely and my tent was gone. The clearing was empty, as if I'd never been there. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack, which was miraculously still there, and started down the trail. The lights didn't follow, but I could feel them watching, their presence lingering just beyond the edge of the trees. I reached my car just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. I've always been a solo hiker. There's something about the solitude of the wilderness that calls to me, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the whisper of wind through the trees. It's my escape, my sanctuary. But after what happened last summer, I'm not sure I'll ever step foot in the woods again. It started with an impromptu trip to the Appalachian Trail. I'd been stressed with work and needed a break. The trail had always been on my bucket list, so I packed up my gear and set out for a 3-day hike. The first day was uneventful. Serene views, the scent of pine, and the occasional deer darting through the underbrush. By dusk, I'd found a small clearing to set up camp. It was perfect, secluded and quiet, with a soft bed of moss for my tent. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like the crunch of footsteps in the distance. I dismissed it as an animal and rolled over, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. My breath caught in my throat. It was deliberate, measured, not the erratic movement of wildlife. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a raccoon, and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints near my campsite, human footprints. They circled my tent, overlapping in places as if whoever it was had been pacing around me for hours. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it had to be another hiker who'd stumbled across my camp and decided not to disturb me. I shrugged it off and pressed on. The second night, I chose a spot near a creek. The sound of running water was soothing, masking the natural rustles and creaks of the forest. Exhausted from the day's hike, I fell asleep almost immediately, but once again, I woke up to a sound. This time, it was different. A low, guttural humming, like someone murmuring a tune just out of earshot. I froze, straining to listen. The humming grew louder, weaving through the trees surrounding me. My heart pounded as I unzipped the tent, flashlight in hand. The beam swept across the clearing, but the sound stopped before I could pinpoint its source. I sat there, clutching the flashlight until dawn, too terrified to sleep. When the sun finally rose, I found something outside my tent that hadn't been there the night before. A small bundle of sticks, tied together with a strip of red fabric. It was eerily deliberate, almost ritualistic. I felt sick. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was out there, and they were watching me. I decided to cut the trip short. Packing up my gear, I set off in the direction of my car. The trail felt different that day. The birds were silent, and the air was heavy, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd hear the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I spotted a figure ahead on the trail. Relief flooded me. Maybe it was another hiker. I quickened my pace, calling out, "Hey!" The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, motionless, facing away from me. As I got closer, I realized something was off. Their clothes were tattered, and their skin was an unnatural grayish hue. Then, as if sensing my presence, they turned around. I wish I could say I remember their face, but I don't. My mind refuses to hold on to it, like a smudge on a photograph. All I know is that it wasn't human. I stumbled back, heart racing, and when I looked again, they were gone. Just gone. I ran the rest of the way to my car, adrenaline propelling me forward. When I finally reached it, I threw my gear into the back seat and sped off without looking back. To this day, I don't know what I encountered out there. Was it a person, a spirit, something else entirely? All I know is that the woods don't feel like a sanctuary anymore. They feel like a trap, and I'm not sure I'll ever escape the shadow of what happened that summer.